Hello. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Getting broadcast, getting set up. Come on, my little pretty. You can work, little camera. You can work. The amount of people who arrive here early. Is live. Well, if YouTube's telling me I'm live, I'm going to presume this is working. Yes, I've got 14 people. That is very, very nice. I'm happy with that. Is there going to be more? Thank you, Lightning Shadow. Yes, 'tis Francis' fault. Thank you. Yes, thank you all. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Richard. I'm live. Richard Hughes, evening. If any of you haven't seen Dr. Andrew Lambert's The Other Crimean War, I suggest you check it out. I completely agree with that. Before we get into this, I will say one thing. Andrew Lambert doesn't write a duff book. He sometimes writes and this is he's my former supervisor, so I have great love for him. He's looked after my supporting me the whole way through my PhD. Was an amazing supervisor. He sometimes writes a book which has a lot of side stories in because he finds them as fascinating as I do, but he doesn't write a duff book. You can find the side stories, though, as distracting and as fascinating as the main story you picked the book up from. Cosmo Flanker, greetings from Iowa. Goodness gracious me. Thank you for joining us. Hello, Raf4. Hello, Blue Shirt Buddha. Hello, Sheppy42. Potter. Hello, thank you, and thank you for joining us. Right, so it's roughly 6 o'clock. And today's discussion is on the most forgotten ships ever. Sloops. Now, in the nicest way, these are really, really forgotten. The reason they're so forgotten is because they're titchy. They average around about 1,000 tons. And there are slides up on AC_Naval History as always. So if you want to go see the slides closer up, they will be on AC Naval History. You can find them I've loaded them already up there under slide notes. So hashtag slide notes should bring them all up. But if you just want to follow them as they come up live, I will also be tweeting them live as we're going through. So the slide notes will be coming up. And I've got good news in that the webcam is supposed to be arriving on the 30th of April. So then I will hopefully from that point be able to do this properly and able to flash up the slides to you so you can read them properly rather than me doing this. Good evening, Dave in California. Good evening, Dragon Fanel. Good evening, Michael. Good evening, Steve. Evening, everyone. And thank you and welcome for coming along. So, the first two slides I'll have put up on Twitter are these two. A little context and this one. Now, the little context is something which I want you to all think about. And I will get into this straight away. Sloop is not enough of a name for a corvette. I've seen there's already been a question about that from Steve Nash. It's not enough a name for a corvette. Sloops and corvettes are actually different, although they sometimes swap places because during the Napoleonic Wars, the sloop was the smaller vessel and the corvette the bigger vessel. In World War II, the sloop was the vessel built to naval standards. The corvette was the vessel built to more civilian standards, usually built in civilian yards. So they sort of swap over. The corvette goes out of use for a long time, is brought back in World War II. Sloops, now they are in use for pretty much the entire time because the Royal Navy always needs small ships for the presence mission, whether they are surveying, policing, being the yacht, all sorts of things they are there for. And by the way, when you start talking about an admiralty or a commander-in-chief's yacht, it sounds like they've got this beautiful excursion, they've got this lovely ship for their sole use, and it's a wonderful perk of the job. It's entirely for diplomacy. Basically, consider a naval yacht in this period. When a ship's designated a yacht, it's basically your mobile diplomatic headquarters hub. It's for entertaining guests. It's for going in close to shore and still having a warship there. It's for all the things which you need a ship for. Right. So, sloops. Now, between 1928 and 1939, the Royal Navies, and I use the phrase the Royal Navies here because I'm covering the Royal Navy itself, the Royal Australian Navy, and the Royal Indian Navy. Those are the three which primarily are ordering these things. Order 51 sloops. That is 73 if you include the Hastings class. Now, the Hastings class are minesweepers. Sloops are often used as minesweepers, and Hastings class are actually defined as minesweeper sloops. So they are that. And sloops can also be used as gunboats, but they're usually more ocean going. So when you're thinking of a sloop, you have to think of, in closest modern parlance, what we're looking for is something like the River class batch 2s, the OPVs, the new ones the Royal Navy has, or the Nudramundsen class of the Danish Navy. These are the sort of vessels that you're looking at. Sorry, Greg. When I set up the camera, I was sitting here, and now I have sat forward, and it's cutting my head off. I do apologise. Also, if you cannot read the shirt completely, I'll just tell you what it says, which is, of course, I talk to myself. Sometimes I need expert advice. My family actually bought it for me for when I went to the National Archives, because people used to ask me if I was talking to myself. I actually am sometimes having conversations with admirals who are long since dead because of the quality of their note keeping, and I'm basically in very polite form without swearing, because I'm surrounded usually by older ladies and gentlemen. It's not polite. I'm telling them off for keeping appalling notes. Now, in a future session, if you want to, I will go into what the sloops get up to in World War II. And I will quite happily get into that story and go into all the modified Black Swans and all the anti-submarine warfare and all the long-range convoys they do. But at the moment, I want to do sort of like I did with the aircraft carriers, and that I'm looking at the interwar period, because that period is completely forgotten, and it provides the basis for all that comes in World War II. And it is completely forgotten. Now, the sloops in the Age of Sail, the most famous one, I would argue, is HMS Pickle. But some people call her a schooner. And I'm very sure, if I am currently disagreeing with whatever Kate Jameson, a very, very good naval historian of the Napoleonic War, thinks, I'm going to be getting several tweets very quickly explaining to me why I'm wrong. But in my book, the Pickle is a brig. She's a Bermuda sloop. And that's what she's designed as. This is HMS Seagull, which is also another sloop. Now, the reason I picked these is I want you to have a look at what they are. They are very small ships, but they are essential for naval operations. As it starts off back in the 1700s, it carries on like this. And it carries on. Now, if I just quickly tweet out, or make sure it goes, the next set of slides, I'll then put them up and explain them. And eventually I will get this stuff working, so it does it on my voice command. Now, the next set of slides are the important things, because the Royal Navy starts building sloops again, really, because it builds so many in Model 1. It builds almost 100 of the things. It's churning out sloops like anything. The Flower class sloops of World War I, notice that name comes up again, are critical for the for the escorts of the convoys. And there are all sorts of things they're going into. Now, the sloops are defined in the 1930 by a treaty. Now, in 1928, they start being built again. But the Royal Navy is building only a few. Then in 1930, there is a very nice treaty which comes out. And the treaty the London Treaty, the first London Treaty, pretty much states that naval surface combatant vessels which exceed 600 tons but do not exceed 2,000 tons, provided they have none of the following characteristics: mount a gun above 6.1 inches, mount more than 4 guns above 3 inches, and are designed or fitted to launch torpedoes, or are designed for a greater speed than 20 knots, navies can build as many as they like. Now, for a couple of years, the Royal Navy doesn't really do much with that. In 1933, though, as I've said before, they appoint a new Third Sea Lord. And he's the type of Third Sea Lord, Admiral Henderson, to look at a clause like that and think, yippee-ki-yay. Now, this does mean, though, it causes a few interesting assertions when I'm talking about sloops. One of the most interesting ones is that they are anti-aircraft vessels. Yes and no. Pretty much, the Royal Navy found that if it tried to fit the 4.7-inch gun, especially on the smaller sloops of the destroyers, it wasn't the most stable weapons platform for it. So, so they had a 4-inch gun. And the great thing about the 4-inch gun was it was also good for anti-aircraft. And as an anti-aircraft system, it could allow them to protect convoys. And the Royal Navy was, even in the 1930s, was worrying about protecting convoys from air attacks. Chaffers and Bray has just put up an interesting question. So the insect class already counted as sloops, hence they kept them. They were counted under the sloop heading. They weren't called sloops, they were called inshore, and they were called gunboats. But they counted under what was defined as the small ships. And the Royal Navy, they called the small ships sloops. Other navies had other things. Just before I lose my voice. Yes, it does come down to Henderson. Now, these are the sloops which are in service in the Royal Navy, are providing the bulk of the force in the 1920s and 1930s. They are called the 24 class. Now, for anyone who wants to guess this as why they're called the 24 class, it's disturbingly boring and shows the Royal Navy really have no imagination when it comes to doing this. They build 24 of them. What I find and why I've brought this class in is because one of the jokes I have when I'm talking about these sloops is that the stone frigates the Royal Navy calls their Royal Navy Reserve bases, they're all called stone frigates, are actually stone sloops, because their names, Flying Fox and Eaglet and President, all belong to sloops. They weren't frigates. So actually, when we call them stone frigates, it's wrong. They should be called stone sloops. And I will probably get told off by a naval officer at some point for saying that, but that is the case. And I tell it to them on a regular basis. Now, the point about a sloop is it's a very minimally armed vessel in many ways, because its purpose is on being able to go long range. Its purpose is to wander around. Now, the first class that comes to the set that we are really interested in, and I'm just going to tweet out again another set of pictures. Are the Bridgewater class. And this class will be the 24 Twitter class side should have just tweeted out. And as I've said earlier, but as we've shot up, in massive numbers. I've already put out all the slides out under the hashtag slide notes on AC_naval history. So if you want to go ahead and get all the slides, you're more than welcome to. And again, I do apologise. The webcam is supposed to arrive on the 30th of April. Things will hopefully improve. Now, this lovely vessels are the Bridgewater class. Now, There are only 2 of them built. The HMS Bridgewater and HMS Sandwich, and they're 1,000 tons, well, 1,045 tons. They have a length of 250 feet, a beam of 34 feet, a draft of 10 foot 6 inches, and a speed of 17 knots. They also carry 2 4-inch guns. Now, they have a tremendously interesting life. They are built for the Persian Gulf, and they spent all their life operating in the China Sea, and most in South China Sea. They are doing surveys. And one of the interesting things, if you consider, okay, so to make a survey ship, what the Royal Navy would do is take the guns off a sloop and add on the equipment for surveying, so it become a survey ship. And so HMS Bridgewater spends half her life either being a survey ship or escorting survey ships, because when a survey ship's doing a survey, it could, of course, become under attack from pirates or anything like that. So you have a warship to protect it. Hi, Brad Pittler. And Strub, the US Coast Guard fast response cutter would fit if this fit description of sloop. Yes, it would. It would. Those are enough modern ones which would fit it. And sloops are very much the useful ships. The whole point is you can actually churn them out in rather large numbers. And this is what starts to happen, because the Royal Navy has a couple of years where, frankly, not much comes of them. You have 2 classes come out in next after that build on the Bridgewater. They are, and I'll just tweet them out now before I get into them. Yeah, this is the joy of TweetDeck. It's making sure it works. And that's... Hastings class and Shrum class. Are the Hastings class and the Shoreham class. Now, the Hastings class are interesting because they're in many ways the far less well-armed ones. But they are used for diplomacy in all the things they do. And they're really critical about it. If you think about it, again, it's 1,000 tons. And by the way, these ships are all roughly 1,000 tons that I'm talking about. It's 250-foot beam. It's 34-foot 1-inch beam. It's 250-foot length. It's a draft of 12 foot 6 inches. It's a speed of 16 knots. All their engines are designed around long-range endurance. And sometimes their endurance is literally listed on the... And actually, if you really want to be depressed, you read this book, because it basically treats them as they're forgetting. And these, this just ignores them pretty much. It ignores sloops because for Janes they don't matter because they're not big warships. But what these ships are is they are the diplomatic hubs for the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy is building destroyers to fight battles. It's building sloops to fight peace. So they are out on the imperial policing with cruisers. There is one of my followers, I keep forgetting which one it is when I want to say it out loud on these videos, keeps calling the Swordfish a helicopter. Sloops were the helicopters of the imperial age because they were supposed to be going around and basically providing the maximum presence for the cruiser, which they'd often be attached to. They have reciprocating and turbine engines. Their engines evolve. As they get more efficient, they improve the engines. So whatever's the most efficient engine available at the time to get the maximum range is what they go with. And these ships are really, really for the diplomacy. For example, I've got here HMS... here's the thing. 2 events, right? So, I have talked for ages, and probably mentioned on these a few times, about the events of Tsingtao in 1939, in January 1939. when the Royal Navy had a merchant vessel, the SS Vincent de Paul, is taken hostage, basically, by the Japanese. He has been doing something wrong, but the Royal Navy don't like him being taken. The Japanese have 3 heavy cruisers in the harbour in Tsingtao. It's their main base in China for their navy. And the Royal Navy sends in a cruiser, HMS Birmingham, a town-class cruiser, to come and get her out. She's backed up by, HMS Folkston. Yes. This is her backup to face off against 3 heavy cruisers armed with 24 8-inch guns across them. And remember, she only carries 12 6-inch guns. She's backed up by this beauty with a single 4-inch gun. Do you know what's even better? When they are actually leaving the harbour, HMS Folkston is at the front of the convoy. Then it comes the merchant ship, the SS Vincent de Paul. Then it comes Birmingham. The Japanese ships, of course, point their guns at HMS Birmingham. They all turn their guns. HMS Birmingham turns her guns to point them at the bridges of each of the 3 Japanese cruisers, and another turret is pointed at the Japanese land headquarters. HMS Folkston swings her 4-inch gun around as well. Think about this. This ship, 1,000 tons, up against 10,000-ton heavy cruisers. She has no chance. A single 8-inch shell will obliterate her. And she still turns her 4-inch gun around to face the enemy. That's pretty darn cool. And they get out, of course. The Japanese don't fire, the British don't fire, and everyone goes home. It's lovely. But I would love to find out what they're actually aiming at. I've looked through, and there have been various orders as to whether or not they were aiming at one of the cruisers, or they were aiming at the Japanese police cutter, or they were aiming at what they were aiming at. But they were certainly aiming at something that they probably didn't have much of a chance of sinking with their 4-inch gun, but they were aiming. This was the backup for HMS Birmingham. This ship. The Royal Navy built 2 classes of sloops at the same time. 2 slightly different classes. The Shoreham class, they were slightly bigger, slightly more roomier, and they were supposed to be, well, they're pretty much exactly the same, but they're slightly narrower draft. And you have the Hastings class are better sea boats because they have a slightly deeper draft and a slightly wider beam. Well, no. They have a slightly thinner beam and a slightly deeper draft, which makes them better at sea, going to sea. These have a slightly wider beam, but a shallower draft, which enables them to go up and operate inside the Chinese canals, the big canals and rivers inside China, and go wandering around them. And that's actually very critical. That's why they are used as the yacht for the Commander-in-Chief China. Because when he wants to go and visit and find out what the Japanese are doing inland, he need never leave a Royal Navy warship. He can take his yacht straight in. Doesn't stop. Goes in, goes up the canals, has a look around, is able to do what he needs to do. Lightning Shadow. I am not reading that out loud. I agree, but I'm not reading that out loud. But these are the beginnings of this. And a change happens very quickly. Because in 1933, as we know, a gentleman called Admiral Henderson becomes the 3rd Sea Lord. And he has a slightly different appreciation of rules than some of the others. He pretty much goes, right then, I need to build a long-range convoy escort for any future global war. Because wherever the war takes place, and remember, the Royal Navy are thinking about fighting a war on a global scale. The whole world. I've lost my other map, but they're thinking about fighting the whole world. This is why I have all these commands up. That's why I have that. So, wherever they're fighting, they're going to need a long-range convoy escort. Destroyers are designed for high speed. That doesn't always make them the best for endurance. Thank you. The destroyers are designed for high speed. It doesn't always make them best for endurance. And I do get very excited when I'm talking about this. But the sloops are designed for endurance. They are lower speed. Their engines are modified. They're formed around providing a consistent speed, which is not too dissimilar to that of a merchant ships. So they can provide them the escort they need. And Bandhelm, welcome. Jeff, thanks for the nod about taking a drink. So, these are the two classes which have come up. The Grimsby class, these should now be online, and the Hastings class. Now, the Hastings class are Minesweepers. And I've put 21 down there. They actually order 22, but one of the Minesweepers gets destroyed in construction. Basically, it gets bombed while it's being built. And they're under construction. These are the premier warship, premier minesweepers the Royal Navy's building prior to World War II. These are their critical mine warfare. Please notice one of the names included in their class. HMS Seagull. So, HMS Seagull of 1940. HMS Seagull of 1840. Notice a small difference? But this class, the Minesweepers, are based on a cut-down version of these, the Grimsby class. Now, does anyone notice this ship? This ship is now known as H2S Wellington, and she still exists to this day. She sits on the Thames. She is the headquarters of the Honourable Company of Master Mariners, from memory. And she's a wonderful ship to go around. When I was doing my PhD at King's, every year when I was teaching the naval on the naval history modules, I would find a reason to take the students down to go and walk around her and look at her, because she was literally this World War II warship, this critical ship of imperial presence, of policing, of global presence and peace, and she was sitting literally down below them. You could see her outside on the windows from the classrooms. She's also very beautiful to look at. But most importantly, when I take the students around her, and if you go look up her colour photo, which will be on my my Twitter feed, because it's in full colour, not the black and white I have on the printer here, you'll see she's brilliant white. That was the colour they were painted for Imperial policing. They're painted that colour partially as a look at me, partially because it would make things cooler, and that was important when you're on a hot station, but mostly because when the Royal Navy paints a ship white, it's very easy to spot where it's dirty. If you therefore keep it as clean as you can, you give the impression whenever you enter harbour that you have a very efficient ship. It doesn't matter if you're dealing with crew discipline issues, it doesn't matter if you've got problems in your undermanning, and remember, sloops usually had crews less than 100. If your ship is bright white and you keep it bright white, you give the impression to any other navy, any politician, any government, anyone who's looking at you, that you have a very efficient ship. This is why on Twitter sometimes you will see me getting annoyed when I see the state of ships being allowed to get into disrepair, being allowed to get rusted. And I know it's not the crew's fault. The crews on warships will, even to this day, always understand this, that the better they present their ship, the better the impression it gives the opponents, and the less likely there is to be war, because the more efficient your navy looks, the better it is at deterrence. When the ships are in ships have rust showing, are looking beaten, and these things, that is always a case of the infrastructure behind them being mucked up for some reason. A bright white warship turning up was a thing to behold. It's also a very massive statement of confidence. Interestingly enough, this is the larger class. They have far more guns, they have far more weapons than this class. Yet, when Birmingham has to pick which of the sloops it was actually operating with to take with it into Tsingtao, it takes this one and sends this one home. It takes this one, the older one, the less well-armed one, and sends this one back. Now, Captain Brind did have a reason for that. Captain Brind's reasoning was that if he sent the more powerful warship home, then the Commander-in-Chief would still have that ship should everything go wrong. And he judged that Folkston was powerful enough as a backup for the level of backup which he could get anyway. It wasn't much of a difference, so he'd go with the ship which was slightly less powerful, but still able to do the job, rather than the ship which could still be very useful at home. Now, the Grimsby class should be famous for many reasons, but also they produce, of course, the Hallison class, the Minesweepers. Now, I want to bring up one of this particular class, even though it's not an interwar period. And as I said, if there are enough comments below, and if people want me to do what they get as sloops get up into World War II, I will quite happily do that. But today, we're looking at what they were used for in peacetime, how they developed in the interwar period, how they were used for diplomacy. But there's one example I want to use. Now, in the destroyer one, recently, I discussed about HMS Glowworm and how she was, of course, sunk by Admiral Hipper. And she was, of course, sunk by Admiral Hipper when she was worrying 2 German destroyers. Well, there is another ship which has a similar fate. HMS Bramble is a Hallison minesweeper. So she's like this. She is also causing upset for the Germans while she's escorting a convoy. So they call in Admiral Hipper to sink her as well. So basically, Admiral Hipper's job in World War II, this is the ship I'm of course talking about, seems to be to go around sinking much smaller Royal Navy ships because they're scaring the other Germans. Now, there is a good question that's come up, and I'm going to get into it now. Vincent van der Vine, how useful was a sloop as a support to a light cruiser when it's going up against multiple heavy cruisers? Well, you can't match them pound for pound unless you've got your own force of heavy cruisers or battleships. So you're not going to be overwhelmed them. So it's not for a fight. But if you're talking about for presence, for diplomacy, for having a second ship on there, its value is beyond question. Because by having a second ship there, they could have one go one side of the merchant vessel and one the other side. Basically, they could have HMS Folkston go in front of the SS Vincent de Paul as it goes out of Tsingtao Harbour, instead of Birmingham having to cover both sides, which Birmingham couldn't do. If we consider the current circumstance we had recently in the Straits of Hormuz, where the Royal Navy had one frigate out there, we then had to rapidly deploy a destroyer and other ships because you need the second ship there to actually have the presence. It would be more sensible to have a forward deployed, have more river class, and have another river class forward deployed out there, maybe slightly up armed compared to the current ones, as the backup. That was what the sloop was. So basically, the sloop is this smaller ship, which Okay, might not be a full-on warship in terms of facing off against a cruiser, but it's enough of a threat that it is an actual warship, and you're only going to get past it if you actually fight it. And the moment you fight it, you're of course declaring war. Because again, 2 ships turning up, that is the Royal Navy sending in a squadron. That is a force arriving. Doesn't matter what those 2 ships are, it's still 2 ships turning up. It's showing what value the Royal Navy places on this incident. Sloops, of course, and I will just put this out there, remember, cannot be armed according to the interwar rules with torpedoes. So, their definition, if we return to it, they can mount a gun, they can't mount a gun above 6.1 inches, they cannot mount more than 4 guns above 3 inches, and cannot be designed or fitted to launch torpedoes, and cannot be designed for a speed greater than 20 knots. And it gets... One of the other requirements is they cannot be fitted to receive aircraft on board from the air. So basically you can't build a 2,000-ton aircraft carrier. They have fun with these things. Now, so I really do want you to actually go look up the Grimsby class, because H2S Wellington, if you can get to London, go and have a look at it. Everyone goes to see Belfast, and I will always support everyone going to see Belfast, because that is a wonderful tour. My poor girlfriend actually went round with me on it for Valentine's Day, so that is a very good girlfriend. I've said this story before. But I also have taken her to HQS Wellington, and I've taken classes there because they are good. Depth charges were something they were allowed to be fitted with. And this becomes important because if I start tweeting out the next ones, which should be the Kingfisher class, he says. Yep. Slide set 6 should be up. So, Admiral Henderson, as I've been over before, is a bit of a, how do I put this, an activist admiral. And he becomes 3rd Sea Lord in 1933. So the first class that gets ordered in 1933 are the Kingfisher class. And they are the babies. They are an experiment to see how small a ship you can build to actually have weapons. Now, why is the Royal Navy doing this? Well, because Henderson has 2 issues. In any major war, he's going to have to turn to commercial yards and start churning out convoy escorts. They are going to be trawlers and they are going to be corvettes. And by the way, corvettes are already going around as an idea. They're just working out what yards and what they can fit in them. So, this is what they're looking at. Kingfisher class are all babies. They are 518, 539 and 589 tons. They all have the same armament, but they work out very quickly. The closer you get to 600 tons, the better they are at sea keeping. And that is the joy. The better they are at sea, the bigger they are, the better they are at sea keeping. So the Royal Navy starts to think, okay, 600 tons is about what we need if we're going into anything like heavy water. And that does start to sort of bring things up. But listen to these names they're picking out for them. Kingfisher, Mallard, Puffin. By the way, the one on top is HMS Puffin. Just imagine the jokes her sailors had with that and smoking cigarettes and pipes. HMS Puffin. I think we can all imagine the jokes the Royal Navy sailors were having. Marauder knife. So a plane is okay as long as it's a warplane. I've seen the conversations going on quickly about planes. So yes, they could be used as seaplane carriers, but they couldn't be an aircraft carrier. So that is how the French are getting away with it. But honestly, the Royal Navy don't really look into that because to be honest, they have decent-sized aircraft carriers. The French have the Burn. That can affect your Navy's approach to naval aviation. This class, though, are the critical ones. These are the Bittons. They are 1,190 tons, and they become the basis for not only sloops that come after them. So every sloop class which comes after them are based on the Bittons. They're the Hunt class destroyers are based on the Bittons. The Flower class corvettes use a lot of similar ideas, but are most importantly the frigates that come later in World War II, the River class, all their vessels, they are based off the Bitton design. Okay, the Bitton is the very first ship which is built in 1935, which is Henderson completely mucking around with people, and he's honestly building a long-range escort vessel. And he does this by a very simple trick. The Admiralty needs a new yacht. The Admiralty's own yacht has to be very long-ranged. There's no point building one ship to a design when you're building a long-range ship, First Sea Lord. No. So, they order this class. What's interesting, though, is that HMS Bitton officially isn't the first vessel built. She's the third, because the first gets her name changed to HMS Enchantress. And yes, HMS Bitton does get lost in Norway in 1940, actually in Namsos, while supporting the amphibious operations going on there. But we're talking about how to get in. So he's actually using, and this is the interesting thing, he's using the diplomatic needs of the Royal Navy in peacetime to build the ship it is going to need and test out the design it's going to need for wartime. Okay? This is why I've got one of the slides which comes up, and they're all sort of my ideas that I use when I'm talking about the future episodes coming up and those things. It has, when a ship's built for war, it's building for only half its capacity, half its life. And this is the thing. By building a ship for its peacetime peace roles, he's actually building a ship which is more capable for the wartime roles. HMS Stork is another member of the class. She's completed as a survey ship. So the Royal Navy really doesn't have to worry about her, because again, survey ships are completely free and easy in terms of treaty. They are completely ignored by everything. In 1939, she's pulled back from the China station, and by the time September comes around, she's rolling out of Devonport with all her weapons in stock. This is how the Royal Navy is building up its fleet of escort vessels. This is what it's doing. These are the escort vessels it's going to need to fight a war. So when we talk about procurement and we focus on cruisers and battleships and aircraft carriers, that's great. They are critical for fighting the battles, for fighting and getting control of the sea. These are the ships which are critical for exercising that control, for being able to move your convoys. So, he doesn't stop, though, with the Bittons. No. He has two more classes in him. In fact, well, more arguably, but we won't get into those. Just quickly get them to come up. Now, these next classes are the Aigrette and the most famous class of sloops of all time. So famous that actually every now and again you have people come around and start talking about how we need to build a new version of them. The Black Swan class. Now, here's the interesting thing. Because technically they're listed as three separate classes. But Bittern class, 1,190 tons. Egret class, 1,200 tons. Black Swan class, 1,105 tons. All pretty much, give or take, around the same weight. Bittern, 266 feet. Length. Egret, 276 feet. Black Swan, 281 feet. And by the way, there is a reason why there is a picture of the Graf Spee here. Because I wanted to give you the biggest joke the Royal Navy ever pull on the Germans. And I'm going to call this a joke, although it was all done very nicely. Because this is HMS Flamingo. HMS Flamingo is one of the Black Swan class. Okay? And after World War II, when the West German Navy is being rebuilt, she is handed over to the German Navy to help them as the new Graf Spee. Sorry. This is the Graf Spee that the Germans had built themselves pre-World War II. This is what became the Graf Spee post-Second World War. I'm sorry, this is definitely the Royal Navy pulling a joke at some point. There is something going on here that the Royal Navy's laughing at. I'm not sure what. It's probably in very polite standards. Sloops were built to warship standards. They are all warships. And that is an important part of their construction and how they're built. But because they are so lightly armed, because they're so small, because they're so often unarmed, because they're used as survey ships, or they're classed as minesweepers, or all sorts of things, the Royal Navy can really build what it likes. And also what's interesting about sloops is other navies are less interested in them, really. They really don't seem to get them. The Japanese Navy, I swear, would spend all their money on battleships if they could. I really do think that sometimes when I'm looking at the Japanese Navy. Maybe aircraft carriers would get a bit of money, but battleships would definitely have everything if they could. The American Navy... Oh, they're just loving their cruisers. They really are. The cruisers are living their best life in the 20s and 30s with the US Navy, and everything else is really sort of forgotten. They really do love their cruisers. But the Royal Navy has this rather sort of interesting thing, because if you look at newspapers and some of the popular history, they're obsessed with battleships too. If you look at the reality, they are building, they have the most powerful naval aviation force for the 1920s and 30s. They have all these vessels that can do that. They have all of the cruisers they're building. But they're also finding the time to devote a lot of effort to these ships, to these classes. And the reason they're doing that is because the Royal Navy is thinking about fighting a global war. Because the Royal Navy has to think about fighting a global war. But also, it has to test out its ideas. So yes, it's building these all to warship standards. But by testing out what it needs, a small ship can have, it can also work out what it needs to fit on a corvette, which will be built to merchant standards. It could fit on a trawler that will be built to merchant standards, to make them a viable warship. So by actually building sloops, they can test out their ideas for all the other small ships. So these peacetime ships, which are used for presence, showing the flag, which are little more than gunboats with an ocean-going capability, they become the critical underpinning of much of the wartime strength. Dave Burnham, while the USN started building mass classes of gold-plated destroyers starting in the early 1930s, and I'm not surely that's not entirely fair. Yes and no. I would say that the destroyers that the US Navy builds are definitely very good and very high quality. But if you look at the way they're talking about them in terms of the officers they're looking for them and the way they're treating them in peacetime, they are building them mainly as a response to the Royal Navy having a destroyer force and the fact that they have the treaty allowance for it. They're not so... Let's put it this way. The US Navy builds the Porter class, which are excellent destroyers. The Royal Navy builds the Tribal class. The US Navy, for them, it's all about getting officers up into the cruisers, because the cruisers are going to fight the Pacific War. For the Royal Navy, the destroyers themselves are an elite force. So this is the point I'm making. Where does the elite part of your concentration of your force mine? And I would say that the US Navy, certainly in my studies, and I could well be wrong. If people can make the case, I'm happy to put my hands on saying wrong. Because, you know, in the nicest way, we're all only as good as the study and research we've done. In the research I've done and the studying I've done and talking to the US then I've done, the cruisers were their emphasis. The Royal Navy have this sort of peculiar approach. And in many ways, it's because you have a fleet which is looking one way and a third Sea Lord who's looking another way. And there are parts of the fleet which are coming around to his perspective. But to accommodate both sides, they are all sort of looking at what they're going to do. And they're building them. 'Tis the France fault. Keep the destroyers for frontline war and keep the sloops in patrols, escort, and anti-submarine torpedo boat operations. Basically, the sloops become the patrol and convoy escorts. That's their job. That's what they're going to be built for. I will add this on quickly. There is actually an excellent book on sloops, which is called Arnold Haig's Sloops, A History of the 71 Sloops Built in Britain and Australia for the British, Australian, and Indian Navies, 1926 to 1946. It is a lovely book. I enjoy reading it, but every student I've ever given to has told me it's massively dense and it's very tough going. But it is very, very good. And it has a lot more in it. And also the Global Maritime History site, I have all sorts of stuff about sloops from the Tsingtao events. But what I would say, they are... When you're talking about sloops, you're talking about a presence mission. And also there's another reason why the Royal Navy concentrate on them over other navies. The US Navy has the US Coast Guard who are looking at sloops and sloop-sized vessels. It's their cutters. So they're not really thinking about it. The Japanese, as I said, small ships are never going to be their focus. They are really, really focused on the biggest battle wagons they can get, to use that phrase. But they are they do produce some very interesting designs, but then nothing much. The other navy, lots of the Italian Navy definitely does try and produce some sloop-sized vessels, but they tend to consider them almost large torpedo boats. That's what they're talking about. But the RN were looking at sloops in terms of this imperial policing role and this escort role, because you need present ships. If you're going to maintain a global empire, you have to show up. You have to be present. And especially in days, it's pre-helicopters, it's pre-planes being what they are. You've not got the road vehicles even you used to have than you have now. You have these little ships are the critical terms of presence of showing up and being visible. RAF 4, did the RN have estimates on how many sloops they would need for convoy in each of their war scenarios? Now, hang on, this is actually quite an interesting one, because they did test out the convoys in the sloops, using sloops, and they did test them out in the China station. They usually worked out that for a convoy of 20 merchant vessels, they would need 3 to 4 destroyers and 8 sloops, was what they were looking at. Now, of course, that's a lovely peacetime exercise and everything works perfectly. So I'm fairly sure they were thinking differently by the end. And, you know, it's fun. It's what they're used for, is to do this sort of amphibious not so much amphibious operations, or they're used for amphibious operations quite a lot as well. They're used as the ships which are going to fill in the space. And there is a reason why I have HMS Bittern here, being sunk in Namsos. The reason she's the last slide. And It's because, and I'll tweet her out now, that is part of what they were being used for. She was working with the tribal class destroyers to support the troops ashore, to make sure the people got in there. And she was getting in as close as she could. And she gets hit. She gets sunk by the Luftwaffe. This is also what happens. Because the trouble is for sloops is that even though they are built to Admiralty standards, they are still very small ships. So they don't have really much in terms of survivability if they take a hit. And they do take some quite heavy hits. Although... Sorry, just lost one of the pictures I was looking for. Not her. Ah, there you go. If we consider HMS Bramble being sunk by a hipper, she actually puts up a pretty good fight for a ship with a 4-inch gun. You know, she actually takes it on. Okay, Bandholm seems kind of extreme given the size, but diplomatic roles will need a higher rank. They do. They were usually commanded by by actually full commanders, and sloops are often involved, as Will has actually also written, are often critical because of their diplomatic role. So pretty much because these ships are going so far out on their own and are going to be representing Britain, they actually have a more senior officer than will be in command of a destroyer. One of the examples I have given is that Commander Frank Johnny Walker, who is written about in here somewhere, yes. His second ship was HMS Falmouth, which was the commander-in-chief's yacht of the China station. So that's the sort of role he's going, and he's picked for that role because not only as commander aboard is he the head of the yacht of the commander-in-chief, but actually the other thing is because the commander-in-chief would leave his flag captain aboard his cruiser, the commander would become his flag captain, which is basically the same as his chief of staff. So suddenly you'd go from being, oh yes, I command just a sloop, to being, I'm chief of staff of the China station and the person who the commander-in-chief is going to be bouncing ideas off. That's a very big role, and that's why they were commanders. Jack Ray, would sloops lead corvettes for escorting? I'm thinking the fire class. Yes. Usually the sloops were slightly bigger, they were slightly more capable, and they'd often were used as the command ships in terms of close quarters. But there was also quite often destroyers around, and they were usually even bigger. So if there was a destroyer around, they'd pick a destroyer. Tis Francis Fort, you can have one or two in a smallish port in East Africa without needing nearly as much structure in place. You have presence without the cost. Yes, that is exactly what the sloops were for. They were these forward operating ships. It's one of the reasons why I'm really interested in the Royal Navy's new approach to the River class, the Batch 2s, and how they're going to be forward basing them. I think actually we're going to end up needing more of them if we're going to be forward basing them as much as we're talking about. But I think forward basing them along with forward basing frigates is a good way to go to maximise British presence around the world. And it's taking the idea straight out of what the Royal Navy was doing in the 1920s and 30s very effectively. Stefan Pajung, I saw a German picture of the HMS Bitten which describes her as a flak sloop. Is that a correct term, or why do they call that? Okay, because they're usually armed with a 4-inch gun, which is the high angle one and can do a lot of the AA work, some people have considered them anti-aircraft ships. They're really not. Literally, the 4-inch gun is a product of their size and of the fact that they were used for, in many cases, they were sort of used as convoy escorts. That was what they were for. And so they were escorting things. So they often provided with air defense. And they often were festooned with machine guns because, again, they could be. You know, they're little small ships. They can be festooned with machine guns. They can be festooned with things. If we look up the Bittern class and I just check out, they were armed with 6 4-inch gun AA guns in 3 double mounts, 4.5-inch AA guns, that's machine guns, and 90 depth charges. So yeah, they've got an armament which is mainly orientated around theoretically providing AA. But also remember, the 4-inch AA gun was actually also very good at being used for engaging small ships. In fact, the 4-inch guns were sometimes, when you were talking about the tribal class destroyers, they claimed most of their E-boat kills using their 4-inch guns in the X mounting because the 4-inch gun could fire even faster than the 4.7-inch gun and was enough to take out an E-boat. And if you're a convoy escort, and just a small convoy escort, your job is never going to be fight other warships. That's what you're going to have a destroyer along for. That's what you're going to have maybe a cruiser along for. The job of the sloops, of the corvettes, is to engage submarines with depth charges and is to fend off small boats and fend off aircraft. RAF-4, I think in an age of supersonic fighter aircraft, cruise missiles and fleets of choppers, we lack an intuitive appreciation of the need and power of small vessels for force projection and protection. We do. And one of the things I'm looking at mostly at the moment is when we keep using unmanned surface vessels to protect ships. And that's a good idea, yes. But actually, the thing is, yes, that protects your bigger ships. But if you can have properly tuned up river class modified to be more sloops, you could have a very cheap way of maximizing your force. But the trouble is, it's getting that to be funded without losing the core at which it has to work around. Because remember, sloops work because they have cruisers, battleships, and aircraft carriers and destroyers all behind them. So you see this little ship in front of you and you think, well, I can easily take that 4-inch that ship, so I can't take offence at it coming into my harbour. I really can't, because it's so small. But if I do anything to it, the next ships which turn up will be frickin' colossal and they will blast me to kingdom come. So that is the thing. That is what the sloop trades on. The sloop trades on, it's got just enough firepower. You will have to fight it to sink it, to destroy it. And the moment you fight it, you're, of course, picking a fight with the whole fleet. Jeff Beeler, our end sloops ended up being hunter-killer groups like that led by Captain Walker. Yes, and Captain Walker's starts off with sloops. It's his second command. His first command is an S-class destroyer, a World War I vintage vessel. His second command is HMS Falmouth on the China Station. And she's a Shoreham class. So she's 1929-1931 production of sloops. Band home. How does the junior commanders get experience if not given command of one of these vessels, small units? Well, actually, lieutenant commanders are usually given command of destroyers. Yeah. The Royal Navy would prefer to give, because destroyers often operate in flotillas, so they'll often have a captain and commanders nearby anyway, so they'll give them a lieutenant commander will take a destroyer. Some of these small vessels were given commanded by lieutenant commanders, but also the Royal Navy had a lot of lieutenant commanders going around doing other things. Pretty much, lieutenant commanders could get experience. There were vessels for them to get experience, cutters and other small vessels. But when it came to sloops, they were often commanded by commanders because of their position. But there again, if you're talking about sloops operating, the Hastings class, the Minesweepers, operating in UK waters, they'd have had a lieutenant commander in command more often than not, because they don't need to have the senior officer there. Okay. Chef 3422, 4-inch gun is very flexible on a ship like that. They are. They're incredibly flexible. So it's one of the things I have a lot of fun with is when people tell me, That's an AA gun. That's an anti-surface gun. And I go, well, that can be angled up and that can be angled down. So in nicest way, they can both be used for different rings. But they will they have to be used. Bandholm in the RDN, the Nudrum class sounds a lot like Monosloop. They are. The Nudrum class is an absolutely exceptional class. I often think the US Navy could have built a better LCS if they had gone and taken a closer look at them, rather than I think they tried to. I think the trouble is, the Royal Navy in the 1920s and 30s has the same problem occasionally. And I think on this case, the LCS is an example of the Americans having the problem, in that when you're the world leader, it's very easy to think that you always know best and you can invent the wheel. I think sometimes you have to think that maybe other powers also will develop stuff. The Royal Navy is very good when it comes to the armoured carriers. I would say, though, when it comes to battleship design, I'm not so enamoured with the King George V's. They are a very big compromise. And they were certainly not something that many of the naval constructors or that sort of force were enamoured with either. They felt that the Royal Navy was being incredibly conservative and incredibly, we'll lead the way, because if we go with 14-inch, everyone else will adopt 14-inch. And the only people who thought that were the First Sea Lords. Hi, Andy H. Lawrence Cook, are there any left about now? I've already covered this, but HQS Wellington, which is a Grimsby class, and she sits on the Thames. You can go and see her in London. She's the headquarters ship for the Honourable Company of Master Mariners. Go and have a look around her. She is a lovely ship. They will let you on. You can have food aboard, or you can have a meal aboard her, and she's worth going to. There's a debate going on, I think, with Draken Fennell offering some perspectives, but I've missed his tweet, so I've just seen the reply to him, which has come up. Dave Burnham and Draken Fennell, good point on the size of the interwar RN classes. By comparison, the size of the A through H classes were basically the same as the Farragut through Sims classes. Yes, they are. Basically, what you're looking at is those are the general purpose destroyers. Those are the general purpose ships which the Royal Navy's churning out, and which are in many ways a product of treaty, but also a product of need. That's what you need for your basic destroyer in the 1920s and 30s, because your basic destroyer is built around torpedoes, and the reason it's built around torpedoes is because torpedoes are your best ship-killing weapon. Remember, you sink a ship by one of two ways. You start a fire which is unquenchable and is going to destroy the ship from the inside out. Or, the usually far more efficient and far more effective way, you make such a great big hole in it that they can't stop the water getting in. Torpedoes are the best way of making a great big hole which you can't stop the water getting in. Tis Francis' fault. I imagine it could get expensive manning so many little ships, though. Could snowball in costs. Henderson bluff the treasury? Actually, most of these, our crews are less than 100. Some are a little bit more, some a little bit less, depending on their weapons outfit. But usually it's around about 100 crew, which at that time was considered brilliant, lovely, fine. Remember, you got crews of several thousand on aircraft carriers, on battleships. So 100 extra personnel, honestly, they wouldn't notice. Yes, Jeff Beeler, corvettes were built commercially and were smaller. But the thing is, they were able to know what they needed to put in them based on the experience of building and exercising with sloops. The sloops taking part in exercises had shown what would be sort of needed for a corvette. So instead of the Royal Navy going in and ordering corvettes blind and thinking, oh, we'll crash, we need to emergency build corvettes. They weren't actually. They'd gone, right, and we've tested this out. We know roughly what we need. Here's the plan we have. We found a good commercial site hull, which we can take and use. Boom, boom, boom. We can fit on. This is what we need to fit on it. gun, done, go build. And there's your Flower class corvette. Sheppy 42, wasn't the thing with the King George V's that they were too far along when the escalator clause got invoked? Not really. Not really. Because honestly, maybe, perhaps, possibly because of what had already been chosen by that point for the Tiger class and various other classes, there might well have been a very good 15-inch and potentially a 16 or even greater inch gun designed sitting around waiting to be used, which could have fitted in the same space as the turrets. Decisions were made and they went with them, and in the nicest way. One of the interesting things about the King George V's class is the constant trouble with the quadruple turret. And I can point to papers where you've got Stanley Goodall, where you've got Henderson going, yes, this is an innovative design, yes, da-da-da, yes, da-da-da-da-da. But we have a working treble 15-inch turret. We can design to this treble 15-inch turret very easily. Please let us, because it works. And after they get it out and they're testing it and they're trying to use it and it's causing them trouble, immediately they go back to the treble 15-inch. And you wonder if the Royal Navy's, especially Chatfield, this is Chatfield's big legacy, the King George V class. They are Chatfield's big babies. He's First Sea Lord. He is obsessed with the idea of getting the 14-inch through. He's obsessed with armour. He basically, if any, in many ways, I sometimes think that Henderson is almost playing a political game with him in that by putting up a little bit of a fight, but letting him win and focus on the battleships, and especially on the King George V's, he managed to get everything else he wants built. So Chatfield will sign off on pretty much anything else Henderson wants, as long as his King George V's are built the way he wants them. And that, it just seems... I don't consider that perhaps a particularly nice thing to do, because you're basically consigning a lot of people to serve in less capable ships. But I'm wondering if that was a calculated sacrifice which was made on those. But the sloops are the critical ships for the presence and for providing the escort. So the Royal Navy is building these ships in the interwar period as present ships. They can build as many as they can justify that they need presence. But they also need them for warfighting, so they go both ways. RF4, did the contemporaries realise how visionary and crafty Henderson was? Their write-ups of him post-Second World War certainly do. There is an RAF officer who writes that if Henderson had ever become First Sea Lord, and this he writes after actually Henderson has managed to secure the Inskip Award and get the Fleet Air Arm back to the Royal Navy, so that if Henderson ever became First Sea Lord, then the RAF would have to be very careful about how it continued to exist. I think he also felt the army might need to be worried as well, because Henderson was very good at the Whitehall politics game. Remember, the ultimate thing is he got an aircraft carrier built while claiming it was a forward aviation support ship and called it HMS Unicorn. That is the ultimate example of, I can do this and you will not stop me. It's, he's that. But they do realise how good he is, but they also realise how helpful he is. Because one of the interesting things is, while he's making the case for the Inskip Award, he also turns around and starts fighting the battle for fighter command to get the money they would need for the Hurricanes and the Spitfires. So he actually goes to bat for the fighter command. And you have one of these things is, you have a letter written by the Third Sea Lord to the Committee for Defence. And, basically going, this is why you need fighter protection for the United Kingdom, and why fighters are critical in the bomber war, and why the bomber will not always get through. You have the Third Sea Lord of the Navy making the case for the fighters, which the own Air Ministry won't necessarily make themselves. Some in there are making it, but some are still going, the bomber will always get through, even without developing radar. So I don't think he would have got rid of the RAF. I think that would even be beyond his aims. But he certainly was a product of the system and knew how to play it. John Hart, were avistas the same as the sloops? They were in that category, but they weren't really sloops. You see, each navy builds their own sort of version of what ship's going to be under 2,000 tons. Some build what are pretty much gunboats, or would be... In World War II, the Royal Navy has these things called motor gunboats, which are torpedo boats which have their torpedoes stripped off them and are loaded with guns. What I would say, some of the vessels which are built by other navies, because of the no torpedo rules, are pretty much the same. But they're not called sloops. They're called them other things. But yeah. Engaging strategy. Given their heritage of keen interest in destroyers, torpedo boats and submarines under the Junicoeur school of thought, did France give much attention to the free tonnage in the treaties for sloops? Not really. They do seem to produce some for imperial policing, but again, it seems almost half-hearted. And again, you can understand why. The Royal Navy is a curious force in terms of its global role. In terms of having to be in all these oceans, it has to think about the President's mission far more than other navies do. Because it has to, because it has this giant empire. So it comes up with a slightly different solution. Other navies which have less of that pressure will adapt it to better suit what they think their needs are. David Benham, how were the sloops of seakeepers? We've heard stories about the flowers rolling on the dew. The flowers were really not good. Basically, if you're going for the bigger sloops, this end of the spectrum, they're really quite good. I'm talking about the thing above, not the one below. It's in the slide because, you know, nicest way, the Royal Navy, you've got to have their jokes. But if you're going at this end of the spectrum, the 518-ton job, don't go out in a heavy swell. Tis Francis' fault. Did the Greeks ever bother with sloop-like ships? I thought they rather liked them. Lots of navies have sloop-like ships. Lots of navies have patrol ships of some kind, and are using that. But the interesting thing about the sloops is because the Royal Navy designs them and calls them sloops, and they are built so much for long range, for this sort of slow speed economic war, sort of wandering around. Whereas other navies, especially when you're talking about other European navies, they tend to want a higher speed vessel, so they're less worried about range. So that makes a big difference in your design structure and what you're using them for. Will C99, was the French quad turret any better? Let's be honest. The quad turret is... Quad turrets are very complicated to get to work right. The Royal Navy tries with a quad 6-inch gun for Edinburgh and Belfast, the two largest of the 10 classes. They get shot down. Basically, Henderson and Chatfield, Goodall, and the Home Fleet commander at the time have a very, very polite written stand-up row where you have Chatfield on one side going, I want the quad 6-inch, I want the quad 6-inch, and the other three going, they don't work, they do not work, they are no help at all, they are a hindrance, they keep breaking down. So you have this sort of battle going on, and basically Chatfield basically accepts he loses in the cruisers as long as he wins in the battleships. Dutchman, where were the majority of sloops built? Well, this is another interesting thing. The Royal Navy built them in the UK, quite a large majority, but they also built some in India and some in Australia as a way of trying to expand their ability to build warships. So the idea was that basically the sloop is your entry-level warship. if you can build this little ship to warship standards, you can then scale up and build a destroyer to warship standards. And if you can build a destroyer to warship standards, you can scale up and build a cruiser to warship standards. That's the idea. And remember, the Royal Navy is always planning on hoping it doesn't have to fight a war till mid-1940s. So building these ships in the 1930s is a chance for it to get going into that. And good example of this are the Grimsby class. There are 4 for the RAN, and I'm fairly sure they get built in Australia. Draken Fennell, at Will C9. The French quad turret itself was more reliable, the shells and guns not so much. A rather worrying number, those ended up self-selecting for extinction aboard Ricklew and John Mott. Yes, I would agree with that, but I would also say that the quad turret the French, it's more reliable than the British quad turret. It's still not as reliable as the treble turrets. And the reason is, it's to do with the balancing actually of the turret. Okay? So, if you go into HMS Belfast, you will see, if you go down into the magazines, you'll see the feeds of the shells going up for each of the individual guns. And how it's balancing. And that's complicated enough when you have 3. But when you have 4, and the mechanisms you need to support them, that starts to create problems in terms of displacement for the ship, and it creates problems in terms of maintaining the mechanism, as you either build a colossally wide ship and it's very, very spread out, or it's very, very cramped on top of each other for maintaining. So that's why the things tend to break down and tend to be more difficult to maintain, because it's just one mechanism too many in the set, if that makes sense. So, good Lord, it's been an hour and 20 minutes. Jay Illingworth, Chatfield was a gunnery man, being BT's flag captain and possibly suffering from his early experiences. That is a very nice and charitable thing for Chatfield. Chatfield, actually no. I can be like this about Chatfield because I have the benefit of hindsight. And there is always the chance that he could improve right. And there are many occasions when he does come to back behind Henderson. Once Henderson convinces of something, or Chatfield and Henderson already agree, they are in a formidable team who get aircraft carriers and everything built. It's just that Chatfield has a sort of a position, a view of, I'd say it's almost a pre-World War I opinion of what Britain's status in the world is as a naval power. In that he thinks that by the Royal Navy going for a 14-inch gun will convince the other navies to go for a 14-inch gun and lesser gun by our sheer example. It proves as faultless. It completely fails. And it's another reason why I tell people when people go for, oh, Britain should unilaterally get rid of its nuclear weapons as that will inspire everyone else to. And I go, no. That just won't work. There are many good reasons to get rid of nuclear weapons. There are many good reasons to keep them. There are arguments on both sides of the case. I usually come down on keeping them because, frankly, I prefer that it wasn't just China and Russia and other powers who I'm more worried about had them than just than we didn't. But the argument that you should never try and use for nuclear weapons, like you should never use for guns and comes in again with sloops, is that by getting rid of them, you'll inspire others to get rid of them. You won't. In the case with sloops, having them as a presence force and using these ships as a small presence force meant that you still had ships there. So you could have gone, well, they're not that useful. They're not really that viable in wartime because they can't fight other ships. So we'll get rid of them because we don't need them in wartime. But actually, in wartime, they're excellent escorts for convoys, a very much auxiliary role in terms of fighting, but actually a critical role in terms of the strategy of war. And in peacetime, they are critical for the presence mission because they maximize your visibility around the world. But these are roles which are far more intangible than they are tangible. How do you quantify presence? How do you quantify the value of a little ship turning up in a port and just hosting a party? You can't. But you can qualify it because qualitative analysis will tell you that that produces a better friendships, that produces better relations, that produces a opinion that the British are everywhere. And that works. But it's not really a quantitative support. Lawrence Cook, Draken Fanal, any plans for a vid on Henderson? Absolute legend. That would be something which I wouldn't mind collaborating on, I think, actually. We'll talk about that at some point. Now, Vincent Van der Vine, could you comment on leadership of the Navy and difference in roles between the first and third Sea Lords? Right. So I keep using them, and I do realise I'm probably presuming, and I should not be presuming that everyone knows what the difference is. First Sea Lord is the head of the Navy. He's the most senior officer. He's in charge of the operations globally. He's basically the person who goes up to the Prime Minister and the First Lord of the Admiralty, who's the civilian minister at this time, and says, this is what the Royal Navy's doing. The third Sea Lord is in charge of the building of the Royal Navy. So all the ships under construction, all the ships being proposed through Parliament, all the ships being planned, and quite a lot of the exercises he has a lot of input into, are under his command. So basically, the third Sea Lord is the member of the board who's responsible. Basically, he's the director for construction. He's the one who goes out there, and he's supported by a person called the Director of Naval Construction, who's the senior naval architect of the Royal Navy. Henderson's Director of Naval Construction for most of his time was a guy called Stanley Goodall, who was an absolute expert destroyer and battleship man, who became one of the best aircraft carrier designers as well in the world at the time. Okay. Jack Ray, how did post-World War II affect the mission role of the interwar sloop? To be honest, they started getting rid of them because, again, it seemed like a very easy thing to cut. They were these small ships. What were they used in fighting a war? We've got the Cold War coming. We've got all these things. Why do you need these little ships? And they get mostly cut back to minesweeping roles, to reservist roles and these things, which is why the stone frigates are, as I said, stone sloops. Because actually, it's sloops which are sent to provide the basis for the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserves and the Royal Navy Reserves. Drakenfernal, Alice Lawrence Cook, come on. That one has to be a collab with Dr. Clark here. It can't really be any other way. Well, as I said, we'll do it if you want to. Jeff Beeler, North American Hider in Hamilton, Ontario has two twin 4-inch mounts if you want to check one out. Yes, it does. And again, this is a tribal class destroyer built in wartime. And the reason she's got the 4-inch twin mounts is A, there's a need for more AA defense in the fleet as a whole. B, they're producing guns as fast as they can and want to get these ships into service. And so that's one of the things. You've got the pressure of these guns coming through. You need to get these ships out to sea as quickly as possible. So you go with what guns are available sometimes. Sometimes you go with the guns you want to, and you adjust it sort of. So the Royal Navy wanted to increase its AA power for its forces moving around. You needed more of the 4-inch high angle mounts, especially before the 40mm Bofors come into play. Anyone, Jonas King of Sparta, anyone ever tried quintuple turrets? I don't think they ever actually meant in the service, but I'm fairly sure I remember something about the Japanese trying a turret design, but I might be completely wrong. To be honest, battleships and me are... we all naval historians have areas they focus on and areas they focus on less. Mine happens to actually be battleships. I look at them a lot, I study them a lot, but they're not my strongest area. My stronger areas are destroyers, cruisers, corvettes, sloops. There's a reason why I haven't done submarines yet. I'm not as good at them as some of my colleagues, so I'm actually going, right, would you guys like to do the video? Or would you like to send me notes and I'll do the video? Because I'm happy to do this if you want to. Because I have enough knowledge I can, but I don't want to step onto your toes because you're a lot better than me. So I'll talk to them. And I'm doing landing craft on Thursday. Because landing craft, though, is interesting because it was my dad's passion. My dad was absolutely obsessed with the development of landing craft. And if he hadn't died when he did, he was planning on writing a book about the development of landing craft. So I haven't really got the heart to go through his notes and turn it into a book. But what I have done is I've gone and read some of the books he left me. Not his notes, but some of the books he left me. And I'm going to do a video about it. So I've sort of... getting into his research area, but I don't want to touch that yet and turn it into a book myself because it's my dad's research. He was a naval architect and he was really interested in them. Andy H. Australian yards completed 3 sloops before the war's end. Yes, they did. And they'd completed some before the war even began. The Australians really actually did like the sloops, and they found me. Paul from Chicago. I'm just going to say yes to that one. Jeff Beeler, how many Marines did the sloops carry? Anyone? They didn't technically carry Marines, as a rule. But often on the further stations, they would get detachments added. Like the Admiral's Yacht one would have Marines aboard because the Admiral would want some Marines there. But they wouldn't be many. Usually it was the sailors given a rifle and told to play land soldier. And actually that was the phrase sometimes used for them. Tis Francis' fault. The quads are a kind of weird choice. The RN tends to be forward-thinking but conservative at the same time. The quads were really untested expensive weapons to stick on new battleships. Yes, they were. Richard Hughes. Did Chatfield secretly work for Vickers? Likes the 14-inch too much. No, he didn't. He just is He was a big fan of the 14-inch gun. Jonas King of Sparta. What does the Second Sea Lord do? Second Sea Lord looks after personnel and training. So the First Sea Lord is in charge of operations. This shows how the Royal Navy ranks the importance, because still to say, the First Sea Lord and the Second Sea Lord still exist. First Sea Lord is in charge of operations. Second Sea Lord is in charge of personnel and manning. So they're to look after the people of the Royal Navy. And then the Third Sea Lord was the person in charge of ships and procurement. And it worked well. J. Illingworth. So really you are recreating Pax Britannica, as with the sloops distributed around the world during the 19th century. Yeah, that could be said once you start forward-basing ships, because sloops, cruisers were the forward-based assets. They were the Pax Britannica, because Pax Britannica was always more of a maritime thing than it was anything else. So having them there was the British presence. Force A1. Weren't the Type 81 frigates originally classed as sloops? They are designed for use in the Persian Gulf. There was some consideration to it, but they didn't actually get classed as sloops. There is a reason why the Type 81s are named the tribal class again. You know, it's like the Royal Navy built the tribal class prior to World War II. They are about global reach. They are about global presence. But they're not really sloops. They're considered second-class frigates, and that's what they're built as. Okay, so have I caught up with questions? Almost. 99 Iron Duke. Dr. Alex Clark, how did the 1930s 14-inch compare to the 15-inch? Let's put it this way. If I had to have a choice between being on HMS Warspite with 15-inch guns or HMS King George V, the far newer vessel, I'd have been aboard Warspite every time. Every single time. Dave Burnham, you came to talk about sloops, but Alexander Nation want to talk about battleships. Yeah, they did. I'm still liking the idea of Alexander Nation. And also, I am trying to convince, and so you lot will have to back me up if you want it, Armoured Carriers and I are considering doing a talk about aircraft carriers and having a whole long conversation about it. I think it should be live, and he's not sure. So if you wanted it to be live, please do say it. And Engaging Strategy has produced some really, really cool artwork for it. I think it would be good if we could do a live discussion. I'm not sure how we do it. Probably have to be a live podcast of some sort. Maybe not. Maybe a visual one. We're still working out the software and what to use. But if you do want it, please go and tell Armoured Carriers that you want it live, because I think it should be live. He's worried about, embarrassing himself. I don't think he will, because he's absolutely excellent. But it should, and I think it will be live. We'll see. 99. Tis Franceful. Fitted for, but not with torpedoes. What is one of the interesting things about sloops is how quickly even those ones which do not come fitted with depth charges get fitted with depth charges. How quickly they get fitted with these things. So I think there are a lot of things they are fitted for, but not with. Right then. That has been 95 minutes. So I hope you've all enjoyed it. I'm going to say any more questions before I call it a day and go get some tea because I'm hungry. I hope you've enjoyed it. And what I will say again, please do subscribe, please do share, because as I said, to get the familial bragging rights against my aunt, and I love her dearly, but she did bet that I wouldn't be able to do this. I need to get to 1,000 subscribers. So please do, if you know anyone who's not following and would be interested, please do send them it, because, as I said, familial bragging rights and my ability to do an I won dance next time our family gets together is dependent upon this. Thank you very much for coming along. Martin Sims, do it live, please. No one will criticise. Well, go tell armoured carriers that. If you go tell armoured carriers this, that will be very good, because he's the one who needs confidence. I'm very happy to do it live, but I will go with whichever way is easy he's happy with, because I realise I'm the one who's more used to public speaking, because I'm a uni lecturer. So I'm used to speaking to 600 people. Actually, this is kind of strange, but also kind of nice in compared to that, because it means I get the questions in a nice orderly line rather than just being shouted out and hands up and worry I'm going to miss people's hands. But he doesn't do that. So if you can go and give him the reassurance, I'm hoping we can do this. Thank you very much. Right, as don't see any more questions, thank you very much. And see you for Landing Craft on Thursday. It's going to be a fun one, because the amount of ideas which come through with Landing Craft and some of the amphibious ships is truly amazing, some of the stuff that comes out. And one of the things, the greatest thing that my dad taught me about them, and I will go into this more later, sort of on Thursday, is the landing platform docks. Okay? The ships we consider, HMS Fearless, HMS Albion, what the Americans have in terms of the San Antonio class and these things, these ships, they're all considered they're often considered a post-World War II creation. They're not. The first plans for them start to be discussed in the late 1930s. This is how early they're looking at amphibious warfare. And the reason the Royal Navy's looking at them is because they want to go take troops around the world and operate over the world. Richard Hughes, thank you. Everyone check out Professor Amlet's lectures on YouTube, Jutland and Crimean War. Yes, do go check it out. It's good. It's a lot of fun. Right. Is the Dursby 102, is the interwar and World War II onwards, or back to the X-Lighters? It's going to be the landing craft. I'm going to take it right back to the beginning prior to World War I and take it through, because basically when actually people start deciding to build actually specialist landing craft rather than just using a flat bottom boat. Okay, so when people are just basically using their boat they've grabbed off their ship, that's no point discussing that. But going, they just using what boats are available. But when they start building specific landing craft, that's when I'm going to start and go forward. And as I said, I'm using my dad's books, not his notes, his books. His notes I haven't touched, and someday I'll get around to touching them. Someday I will go and look at those notes, but I can honestly say I can't do it now. Anyway, thank you very much and take care. And I hope everyone's had a nice evening. And thank you very much for coming and watching.